and we're hosting this webinar series all about how to use your SmartLab HQ to support the summer school program that might be going on in your school this summer. This webinar specifically, we're going to focus on making stronger connections between what's happening in the SmartLab HQ and math. And with me, I've actually got someone who has a lot of experience with math instruction, Devin.
Hi guys, I'm sure you've seen me on the last two webinars, but I'm Devin Slossberg. I'm the instructional coach here at Creative Learning Systems, and math is like it's just my heart. I love it so much. If you, after this webinar, want to talk math with me, I'm always down. And also just really interested in a lot of the questions that you guys may have about trying to implement this over the summer, whether it's in math or reading, which is our next webinar. Definitely interested in always learning more perspectives and hearing kind of what's going on in your SmartLab. So, yeah. And specifically, we did a little bit of research on summer loss, or like the summer gap, whatever they want to call it. And a lot of the time they said that specifically math had more of a loss or a gap, I think is a better word to use, simply because we honestly use reading and ELA skills a lot throughout the day. So if you're reading a menu or you're reading a sign, there's just a lot more reading that you can see in your everyday life. Whereas math, a lot of the time I will ask a math question, and I myself am doing this as well, as I'll pull out like my calculator on my phone, or I'll ask Siri. And so because of that, we do see a larger gap when students come back after a summer. Essentially, this has been a lot more than a summer of loss of learning. And so we're trying to think of ways to kind of incorporate how do we make this more of creating more math opportunities. And this quote that I found kind of gives you an idea of who we are as SmartLab Learning and how we can actually apply that to create less of a gap. And it says, passive versus engaged learning. Experts say active, engaged time with students should be the focus when addressing the loss from this year. So essentially, don't try and compact everything and try and hurry up on getting this curriculum taught, but rather creating more depth instead of breadth. So, yeah.
Yeah, and even just with summer vacation, if we're not even bringing into it the effects of COVID and remote learning and lost learning time, there was a 4-year study that looked at students in grades second grade to 9th grade, and the evidence showed that they lost up to 30% of what they learned during the school year over summer vacation. And again, like Devin said, if the people around them, when they're not in school, aren't making those really explicit but informal connections to when math is applied in their everyday life, they just may not have that opportunity to practice it. Obviously, reading books is a pretty common practice with kids, and so that's more ingrained in their everyday life. So integrating more math opportunities with the SmartLab HQ is a great way to just expose students to more of that. And the data from this study also showed that that disparity was even greater for students of color and impacting their learning loss even more. As we're going through and talking about some of these math strategies and how you might integrate math into your SmartLab HQ program and into your summer school program, consider some of these questions: what kind of support you have, how your summer school is structured, the needs of your students who are attending summer school, and then also thinking about how much time you have to work with the summer school teachers or the general education teachers, because that will impact the way that you choose to integrate math. Obviously, if you have more opportunity to interact with those math instructors, you're going to be able to reinforce that content even more. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. Last week, we talked about some different ways that you could integrate SmartLab learning. One that's not on here, we talked about in our first webinar, and that was really how do you bring the SmartLab approach into any learning space? How can you use our 5-step framework for project-based learning? How can you pull in goal setting to really drive student learning? And we discussed some facilitation strategies that will enhance that summer school program. Our last webinar, we really talked about these 3 main models of integrating SmartLab learning. One is using the SmartLab as an enrichment, so an opportunity for students to explore their interests, their passions, to really be creative and focus on those essential skills. This would look a little bit more like a specials class that would be added to summer school as just almost like an elective or like a special. Another model we discussed was using SmartLab learning as an opportunity to apply what they've learned in their core content classes. So think about this coming maybe at the end of a unit or a lesson and allowing students to take those ideas and those skills that they've been practicing and apply it towards a real world application. The final one that we're going to talk about is using SmartLab learning as the context for learning. So it might be coming into the SmartLab and exploring and using that to ignite ideas and curiosity, and then pulling that curiosity throughout a summer school unit or set of activities to really give students that context and purpose for learning. So we're going to talk about these 3 models and how you might integrate math throughout them. So the first one we're going to talk about is application of learning. So this is really leveraging those skills that students have and giving them an opportunity to try them out. So focusing on those math skills or math practices, giving them an opportunity to apply them. And this could be a form of an assessment. It could also be an opportunity, like if students are learning new content, new math concepts, for them to make it more concrete at the end of that unit. And Devin's going to talk a little bit about how you might plan to do that.
Yeah, so we talked about this as being more like a performance task. It depends kind of what you or the teacher that's asking you to collaborate, with SmartLab learning, what are your intended goals? So once you've discovered what those intended goals are, and seen as maybe this is a performance task, ideally you've had time to talk to the teacher and you already know what they've already learned in math class prior to. So essentially, this is not the first time that they're seeing this, but they're actually applying the learning. And so these are just the areas that I went through as I was planning like a performance task for math, was identifying the focus standards. And that is, like I said, with the gen ed teacher, unless you are teaching all subjects, which that's great. Good for you. And you can feel really comfortable doing that without collaborating with them, but just knowing this is the intended goal, and this is how I'm going to measure it. So whether that measurement comes from an exit ticket at the end, a discussion, a reflection that they have with you, are they actually making a product and are you basing it on the product? Are they creating a presentation and you're asking them questions and that's how you're assessing? I think that's definitely important to figure out. And then also that's going to give you the access to what is possibly the misconceptions that kids are going to have. How am I going to present this in a real way? And you'll see an example on the next slide, but this is more thinking about this is what students have learned. This is how they're going to apply it. And this is how I'm going to give them access through that scaffolding without guiding too much, because essentially you do want to see what is that application, and you're using it as an assessment. You want it to be very true to what they know. And then I kind of talk about this in the next slide as well. It's just that idea of scaffolding versus differentiation. And we really want to make sure that those two are separate. And so kind of going into what your role as a teacher facilitator in that application is if they're doing this performance task, you're really just setting that stage. So the first one is providing the entry event. And so you're sparking their interest, their curiosity, and you're really starting to get them to think about the problem. And that's when they're asking the clarifying questions. This should be very open. They should have the ability to have kind of like a discourse about what it could look like. Criteria and constraints is also really important. This could look like a rubric, but this is where you're thinking, what's the authentic audience or the intended audience, and what are some things I might need to think about? For example, you could be thinking about like a weight constraint, like maybe I'm trying to make a catapult, and that's, it has to go a certain amount of length, like the ping pong ball, something like that, where they actually have to do it. It's almost like a checklist. And then it's the misconception. So I always say, like, you should solve it before you teach it. And so you're thinking from the student perspective of, this is probably going to be something that they're going to encounter. How am I going to give them that scaffolding to make sure that it's accessible to all the learners? So if I'm thinking that a misconception about groups versus number in each, how am I going to use questioning to kind of get them to realize that I can use groups or number in each, and they're both multiplication, and they're both going to get to the total. And then encouraging iteration, so growth mindset. Essentially, when I'm done with a project, I'm not done. I can continue and push my learning. Thinking about low floor, high ceiling. So if you're thinking about an activity or a task where something's low floor, all of the students are welcome to come onto the floor. And then it's high ceiling because you're pushing their thinking, and it's not tapped off at a certain area where all of the students can do it. There's an entry point, there's multiple entry points, but I'm not feeling like this is too easy and now I'm bored. And it also gives you an idea and a perspective into their thinking, and how you're going to push their thinking, the next time that they come into the lab. And then the plan for debrief. This is where I think about if I'm using the debrief as assessment. So if I'm like, here, present your ideas, and I really, really want to focus on the process and not, the product. So maybe I'm thinking about, did this student really come to the realization that I should use the most efficient math strategies when I'm solving a problem? I don't want to count by ones. If I count by ones or I make little dots on my paper, I may lose count. And that's something that they could have shared. Like, I didn't get the right answer, but I know why. That might be that might be your actual assessment, versus if you were like, could you show me your math on your paper? Maybe that's your exit ticket. So it really is dependent on what it is that you want to come out of it, as well as what the gen ed teacher is expecting to come out of it. And this is just a quick application of learning project that I created with Ozobot. So I was thinking about, I previously taught in New York City, and I was trying to think, how can I make this place-based learning for students that are learning about elapsed time? And so one of the biggest areas of struggle that a lot of my students can relate to was the New York subway. And so I thought about, like, what if you were a conductor, or not a conductor, an engineer for a new subway line? How can you use elapsed time to create a new subway line where this is an open lesson because they could create all the stops, but I told them a couple of criteria constraints were between each stop, there was 3 minutes unless it was express, then it could be 2 minutes. At each stop, the train stops for 1 minute with the doors open. So let's say they decide to skip that stop, they don't have to count that full 1 minute. But they're really coming up with what is the most efficient route, and then how do I create the time schedule to release to all of the New York City subway riders. And this application of learning was, they're making this timetable or this time schedule, but they're also very open to how it looks. And then at the end, they would essentially have Ozobot show the route of the new New York subway line, and using Ozo codes, because we know, like, Ozobot can speed up if you give it a certain code. So if it's an express and it's not going to stop, it may go faster. And so they're starting to learn more about, how do I program Ozobot? And I'm also, at the end, I have to give you the time schedule. I have to give you the elapsed time. So if I'm a subway rider that gets on at 6 a.m., how long will it take me to get to, the last stop on the train? And if you want to click that later on, you can actually see a little bit more in detail of like how that might look. Or feel free to use it because it took me a little bit of time. So I hope you do. But yeah, that would be an example of application.
So next we're going to move into integrating math as and SmartLab as the context for learning. So giving it that purpose, giving it that real world application, but also giving students an opportunity to engage in these math topics before they start a lesson, and then using instruction to support their progress with the project. And Devon's got some great math routines she's going to share a little bit later, but those are really good to help prompt some of these discussions. So you'll get to hear some examples of those.
And just the planning process, it looks very similar to the previous model, but it's also dependent on how often will kids come to the SmartLab? When will they come to the SmartLab in the sense of like where in the lesson or the new learn material that they're going to go over. So maybe that first day that they come in, this is an entry point. So you just present them with something that gauges their interest, but they know very little. But you still want to identify like what's that focus. Maybe I'm trying to get them to tap into some prior lessons, some prior knowledge about a certain area, and I want them to make the connections. So you think about that first, then thinking about how are you going to make this experience relatable to them so they actually can make a connection between the math, but also make a connection to their real life. How are they going to document their learning? So I think about this as an entry point. Maybe they document their learning simply as like noticings and wonderings. And you, as the facilitator, you're just writing these things down. So you may try and think of what are the things you're hoping students will say versus they go back to the classroom after this period, they get a little bit more of that content, and then they come back and they start to explore some more, and they're really more cementing their learning after they've kind of gotten an idea about it. And so you're scaffolding some questioning, you're thinking about, I want this to be open, but I also want them to get to this intended connection with math. And then planning some sort of discourse, open-ended questions, and thinking about the order students are going to share. So I want students to see this big mathematical concept, start smaller. I know these are the students that are going to use this strategy. I'm going to have them share first so that everyone's welcome to the conversation. Everyone feels like this is an open entrance point, and then it gets a little bit harder. So then I start to go to a little bit more difficult strategies. And then the last one should be the most sophisticated strategy that you see. So that sequencing is definitely something I would consider when you're thinking about that last part, that discourse. And just some of those facilitation strategies, kind of similar to the last one, just providing the entry event and then making the ideas visible. So you are jotting down their ideas, especially if this is the first time that they are exploring and they're in the lab exploring something new. You're not addressing misconceptions, which is a little different than the other model. Is you're just letting them kind of explore, you're letting them discover, and then when they go back to the class, you're bringing that back up. Like, what were the things that you noticed and wondered? What is this similar to that you've learned about? Then you could go back, that second time in the SmartLab where they're really, it's more in context. You're starting to build this idea of I can make those connections. So really, it's just they get to be very curious about what they're doing. And then the way that you're going to elicit their thinking. So, during that second time that they're back in the SmartLab, how are you going to describe their thinking on, an anchor chart? So if they're saying, well, I counted by ones, what will that look like to you? Because I've seen teachers that will write out dashes. They'll go, okay, so you went 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they group the five. Well, that's a different strategy than what that person probably did. So really making sure that you know how to elicit their thinking. That could actually just be put the students' work under the dot cam, and you're writing down their thinking as you're looking at it. Just being really true to what are the things that they're learning. And that kind of goes into the debrief. So just providing opportunity for reflection, and providing opportunity for them to make connections to what other students are thinking as well. So you're just kind of guiding them, um, and it kind of makes the learning more real.
And we've got an example of how you might kick that off with a program like Tinkercad, where, in the SmartLab, it may actually start this project where students are coming in, they're exploring, they're identifying what they noticed, what they wonder, and then having a conversation about it. You can guide that conversation a little bit with some questions around, say they're working on volume. Well, how much do you think you could fit in there based on what they might be building or testing? How could you increase that? How could you decrease that? How do you think you might be able to figure out what would fit in there? Lots of ways where you can ask some of those guiding questions and latch onto those math noticings that they're naturally having, and then pulling those back into the summer school, either block of instruction or classroom. That's where it's really handy to have some kind of communication between the SmartLab and summer school, whether that's a journal that travels with students or whether that's, some kind of slide that gets shared. So, the questions that have come up, and then the classroom or summer school teacher can leverage those to provide some more instruction around those topics. And if that classroom teacher has some experience with this tool or is familiar with the SmartLab, they may even be able to pull up Tinkercad and have some of those math talks or, embed math instruction with the support of that tool because it is familiar to the students. And then the students would go back to the SmartLab maybe the next day, read their challenge, as the facilitator can really help guide a little bit the focus of that project, because most of the liftoff challenges and learning launchers and activity cards are so open-ended. You might say, listen, whatever you build, it's got to hold something, right? Whether that's liquid, whether that's an object, whether that's, tools on your desk or in your garage, whatever the need, that authentic need might be. And have them record, what they know about volume already, what questions they have, what they might need from their summer school teacher to help them move forward with their project. And so then they'd go back to their classroom and receive some instruction around that. Use those questions, say, hey, I really need to figure out, I've got a rectangular prism and I've got a cone in my project, and I need to figure out how to calculate the volume so I know that my objects will fit inside. And that's where then that math instruction can help support their goals that they've set, the plan that they've made, so that when they then move into the do it section, they have those resources and those strategies to work from, and can then apply it and cement those ideas back in the SmartLab as they're actually doing. And then, as Devin said, after they're finished, pulling them back together and getting them to debrief on the math content, the math skills that were helping them to be successful throughout that project. Could also be something where you're saying, what did I know in the beginning? What do I know now? Or how has my thinking changed? How can I approach a problem like this more, or with a similar strategy in the future? Just really recapping all of that at the end. And then the final model we're going to talk about is using the SmartLab to enrich summer school. And again, the focus is generally more on essential skills and leveraging students' interests, giving them a little more freedom to explore what they're interested in, which may be different than kind of what they're able to do in their summer school space. And so one way you can still bring in math is by incorporating some of these project starters that really align with math, either naturally use it, or we've also put some modifications that you can make. Devon's got some great math routines that you can pull in to help launch a project or help get them thinking about that application of math. So for each grade, we have 3 different project starters that you'll find in your SmartLab HQ. We have the standards that can be addressed or reinforced with that, student learning goals, the essential understanding, kind of those big ideas they'll take away, and an essential question to really drive the learning, and then some information about how you might execute it. And I want to talk a little bit about that essential question. Essential questions can be really helpful to drive learning, but really look at some of these topics from kind of a high level or holistic approach. Like Devin said, with a low ceiling, high floor, these essential questions are open-ended. So students can answer based on their experiences and based on what they've figured out in their project, but there's not going to be a right answer necessarily. But using that essential question in the beginning to kind of frame their thought and then coming back to it at the end to discuss, like, what do we now know after this experience? And being able to share that knowledge, we know that is huge in the SmartLab, with any SmartLab program. And so that essential question is a great kind of bookend of, let's use this in the beginning and let's come back at the end and discuss how our thinking has changed or what we've learned, and learn from each other through that. So that resource we will be putting on the Launchpad along with the recording of this webinar and any other resources we're talking about. So we'll make sure that gets up there so that you can use it. But that might be a really helpful tool that will help you plan a little bit this summer. If you know students are struggling with, one of those 3 highlighted standards, then you might guide them or assign them that tool to use, and you've got some ideas and strategies here for how to really make those math connections stronger.
So we started to talk a little bit about this, but if you're finding that you have a lot less time to plan some of these activities, or a lot of people say they have like math trauma and they feel like they're not as comfortable with math. These are just some routines that we're going to go through where they're simply just 5 to 15-minute activities. They're really low prep. And they focus more on the big ideas of math, and they do that through kind of making relations to content knowledge and those bigger competencies. It's just really making sure that this is creating this like risk-free environment where they can explore what are some ways to solve problems, and really building on each other's understanding of problems. And then the quote at the bottom is kind of what I think about when I think about using math routines as something that's done daily or building that habit of mind. And it's children have real understanding only of that which they invent themselves. And each time that we try to teach them too quickly, we keep them from reinventing it themselves. So really thinking about how are they coming up with the ideas on their own? How are they sharing strategies that really make sense to them and not just for you? And in doing that, they're also learning from each other, from their peers. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of what number sense is. And that's the end goal of kind of creating these math routines is number sense or number fluency. I think of it as when you're learning how to read, you have to learn more about grammar, you have to learn more about the fundamentals of literacy, and it makes you more of a fluent reader. That's the same thing with number sense. So they say it can be described as good intuition about numbers and their relationships. It develops gradually as a result of exploring numbers, visualizing them in a variety of contexts, and relating them in ways that are not limited by traditional algorithms. And I'll talk about some of those relationships. So the 4 main relationships that you'll often see, especially elementary, primary math routines, The first one, spatial relationships, and you'll see an example soon, is just recognizing how many by seeing a pattern without counting. So if you've seen a 10 frame, which is what you'll see on the next one, you'll think about, if I know that there's 10 spaces here and there are 2 spaces missing, I know that there's 8. And simply because I'm relating the relationship between the space that is missing, and however way they want to see that, just something with spatial relationships. 1 and 2 more, 1 and 2 less. So it's not really just about counting, but it's thinking about what are ways that I can almost compensate. So if I'm thinking about, like, I know that I need to take 30 minus, 16, but I know 30 minus 15 is 15. So I just take away one more. And so this idea of hanging on to what I already know to use that to solve the next problem. Benchmarks of 5 and 10. I think that there's more than these 2 benchmarks, because I also think about where else do you see big benchmarks, and I see them in money. So I see them as quarters. So 25, 50, 75, $1. And so if they use any sort of benchmark as a role kind of in their own number system, and they kind of relate it to that. So if I know I need to take away 55 cents from 100, I know that 50 cents is 50. I take away that 5 more. I've related it to money. That's my benchmark, whatever their benchmark is. And that's really just them figuring out personally what they're trying to benchmark their understanding to. And then the last one's part whole. So the ability to see a number as being made up of 2 or more parts. The most common, I would say, is fractions. Sometimes we think fractions as just part of one whole, but also part of a set. So if I think about a fraction of these students in this room are wearing a certain color shirt. Seeing it as the whole would be the entire class, the part of the students that are wearing a red shirt. And that's just a way of building that number fluency. So the next one will tell you a little bit about some of those examples. So the first one is the relationships one, which I kind of already talked about. So if you were to give this number routine, kind of how it would look is you would not put the 9 plus 6 up there. You just put the 10 frames, and you would ask them, what's the total, or what do you see? What's the sum, whatever way you want to put it, but you don't actually tell them 9 plus 6. It's just there. At the end, you can get them to see it's 9 plus 6, but essentially you would want students to see, well, I see that there's a 10 frame and it's 1 missing. So actually, the 10 frame next to it has 1 extra in the second row. I don't know if I'm doing a great job explaining this. So they would move that 1 dot on the end over to the 10 frame. Now it makes a solid 10 plus another 5 more that's left over. So they've seen that this whole is 10 and there's 1 piece missing, that spatial awareness. So I can just put that piece, that little circle from the other one, into the empty box. Hopefully you guys can actually picture what I'm saying. But it's kind of harder to describe.
Yeah, but eventually, Devin, students will start doing that naturally just with numbers, right? Where they'll look at 9 and 6 and they'll say, well, if I move 1 over and make 10, I've got 5 left, and I know that's 15. So
right.
This is a great
visual. You can do that with like base 10 blocks. So if you think about base 10, a lot of the time students will count out the base 10, they'll use the ones, and it's not the most efficient way. And so instead, what can I swap out for 10 sticks to make it easier to count? So maybe the first time they see this, the only strategies they see is I'm going to count by ones. So they would go like 1, 2, 3, and like over time, maybe you give them hints like, I wonder if there's another way that we could make this a more efficient strategy. Like, what does this remind you of? Or what do you notice about one of the 10 frames versus the other? Like, really get them to make the relationships without telling them, which is an art of trying to facilitate that. But yeah.
And when you guys check out the guide that we're going to share with the recommended project starters, you'll probably see some opportunities to apply this. Like one of the activities uses geometric shapes. I think there's another one for upper elementary. And you assign a value to it, whether it's whole numbers, $1, $2, $3. or whether it's coins because they're working on, learning money and down to individual coins. And how could you group them, right? If I've got quarters and I know four makes a dollar, I can make groups. So I think it can even extend to that part where they're using kind of that visual, the spatial relationships to make groups that make sense to them.
And the one or two more and less is that idea of compensating, which is similar to that spatial awareness. But if I'm thinking about, I'm subtracting, I keep saying subtracting, maybe if I was adding 11 plus 4, I might see it as I'm actually adding 10 plus 5 because I'm moving one of the numbers over to make it more of a friendly number. We think a lot about like rounding and making it easier for them to create the friendly number is thinking about, could I add one or two more to make it friendlier? Another situation where they wouldn't pull from each side is maybe 11 plus 2. Well, I know 10 plus 2 is 12, but 11 is one more. So I'm holding on to this idea of I know what 10 is, and I know 10 is easy to add 2. So I'm going to add these numbers together, and I'm going to add one more because I know 11 is one more than 10. And so just coming up with ways to see that relationship of I can add and then take one away to make it easier, friendlier. You see friendly numbers with rounding a lot. So can I round it and then take away the difference? 98 is close to 100. Could I round it to 100 and then don't forget to take the 2 away? I'm not starting with 100, I'm starting with 98. I think there's one more. And that's similar to the benchmarks of 5 and 10 as well. So understanding that I know how to add by 5s and 10s. I think about tutor a student on the weekends, and she has been working on her multiplication a lot. And she is like, I really don't feel comfortable when I multiply any number times 6. Like when I'm skip counting by 6, it's really difficult. So I always tell her, well, give me the problem. She'll tell me maybe it's 6 times 4. And I was like, well, you're 5s, right? Like kids often know how to skip count by 5. So I was like, skip count by 5s 4 times. And she would go 5, 10, 15, 20. And I was like, okay, so 5 groups, but I need one more group. What can I add? And it's another group of 4. So that's the 6th group. And she'll add on her fingers that 4 more. So it's like a progression of, I know this benchmark number of 5 and I'm using it. I'm using what I know to build on that idea to make it more comfortable for me. Similar with 10s, if I'm like, I really don't know how to multiply by 11, though there is the trick that I'm sure your parents have taught you by multiplying by 11. But if I was skip counting by 10 and just add one more group, or by 12s, 2 more groups. And so finding ways to kind of anchor your thinking to benchmarks that make sense, similar to the coins. You know how to skip count by 25 cents, which a lot of kids, this is new news for them. If I'm like, what's 25 times 2? They're like, that's so hard. And I'm like, is it? Because you actually have quarters and you know how much 2 quarters is. And so that may be their benchmark, but you just may have to reveal it for them. And it's through these strategies and these routines that they start to realize, like, I can really anchor onto something I know to learn what I don't know. And there's a bunch of other routines that are in those in that guide that we made. There's a couple of routines that I've actually adapted to fit like some of the activities or the learning launchers, and so they relate. But I will also send a link if anyone's interested in actually showing you what a video of this looks like. But essentially, they would show the problem, and then they use mental math, which is really the important part. There shouldn't be writing. It's something they're doing in their head. So if I presented that 10 frame and then they're silent, they get 1 to 2 minutes of wait time. It feels weird. It's okay. You just let the feeling just giving them that think time. And more often you'll see the hand signals. So after you've given them the 2 minutes of think time, you ask them thumbs up if you're ready to share, 2 fingers up, some teachers will do if you have more than one strategy in your head. And then you start to share out answers. And as they're sharing, you're writing down their answers. So if they were like, I counted by 1s, you tell me, how did you count by 1s? Tell me exactly what you did and write exactly what you did. Because you don't want to assume that they tallied them up in their head by 5s, because chances are they probably didn't. And as they're sharing their thinking, you've already thought about like, this is how I want the conversation to go. And so how can I ask questions at the end to get them to think about, you know, what is the overarching idea? So if I wanted them to think about, we shouldn't always count by ones, it takes forever. Maybe I say, like, I wonder what's the most efficient strategy. They tell you the most efficient strategy, and then you kind of leave it with, like, maybe turn and tell your partner, how are you going to be more efficient next time you solve math? And the next day you follow up and you actually have them be more efficient. Like, remember yesterday we talked about being more efficient? I wonder when we're solving problems today, who's going to be the most efficient? Like I said, talk math routines with me. I could go off. I won't do too much, but like, definitely love them, and I will give you all the resources if you guys want them. But this is definitely something that you can incorporate within the first 5-10 minutes of your class, and it's not too invasive on your time. Don't spend a bunch of time. I see someone said yes, please. Yes, definitely will, Anne Marie. Got you. But I feel like this is something that you can do without a lot of prep time. So
Mhm.
definitely think about how you can work with, you know, gen ed teachers to figure out what are the areas that they really need help with, and how are you going to support them without taking up your entire weekend of rewriting curriculum in the summer.
And
So
if you have these math routines kind of in your back pocket, you may notice just natural moments where your students are working on a project and they may even be saying like, wow, this is taking forever. And oh, what a great moment to say, wow, like why don't we try and think about this differently? What's a different way that we might be able to solve this? And pulling those in, whether it's small group or whole class, because that's applicable to everyone. You can definitely pull those in. You'll see throughout that guide that we shared that sometimes it's used to launch the activity. Sometimes you could even pull it in partway through the project when students get to the point where they're doing that kind of math work. So keep that in mind. You might kind of pull the resources together from the guide we're sharing and put them in a little folder, or maybe print them out so you've got them just handy as visuals. Keep in mind that you can always do that, and that might be some minimal prep work with high yield that you can just pull from as you're supporting students and as they're encountering some of those situations. All of these resources will be accessible on the Launchpad. If you missed our first 2 webinars, they will be on the same page in Facilitator Resources. So just remember, you got to log in with your admin login, click that welcome message up at the top, go to Resources, and we've got this down towards the bottom in a section called Other Resources. So we have in there the recordings for each webinar, the presentation slides, and any of the resources that we've mentioned. So definitely check those out. We try and post them within about 24 hours, depending on how long it takes the recording to process. So just keep an eye out. We'll also be sending another email probably on Tuesday, just with some information about what webinars are coming up and reminding you of how to access the resources on the Launchpad. Just so you guys know, you can always access us by emailing academics@clsonline.com. That will actually go to the entire academics team. So Devin and I, our SmartLab designer and our curriculum writer, and we'll be able to put you in touch with whoever is the most appropriate resource to answer your question. And then, our phone number, you can always get to support and they'll route you to the right person if you just want to talk with us over the phone, if that's a little bit easier. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or in the Q&A. I know we got through things a little quicker, so we're ending a little bit early, which will either give you some time to ask questions or to go about your day, start processing some of this information and thinking about how you might want to make some stronger math connections with your summer school program, however that might look with your SmartLab HQ this summer. I don't see any questions coming through, but if they do pop up, I'll definitely, we got Anne Marie raised her hand, right? Anne Marie, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much. I was trying to type and it takes me too long. So my question is, and it's on a side note, because my principal was just asking me about this. Since SmartLab has the new beautiful rebranding, um, our concern is all of our displays have the old SmartLab brand on it. Is there going to be something we can do to match your new logo?
Are you referring to like the shortcut on your desktop? Are you referring to the banners in your
Yeah,
room?
it's the banners because she was asking about that. She saw it. She saw because I told her, I said, yeah, look how it's awesome. You know, we have this thought bubble that's now because, you know, thinking is different here. And they've modified the logo and updated it. And she said, well, how is it going to be updated for everyone that has a smart lab, or is it just, she just wanted some clarification is our scoreboards. And I know this is not the time and place to do this, but I just had this conversation with her before I walked out the door.
Yep.
I can contact just in general and ask for assistance, but she was just wondering, like, our scoreboards have the old logo on it. The banner in our smart lab has the old logo on it, and outside our wall with our big
Yeah.
poster of everything. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll ask.
Yeah, no, I am pretty sure that you would be able to purchase those new banners.
Okay,
I don't have any information yet on whether they're packaging those and like here's kind of your branding upgrade package you can purchase.
right.
What I'll do, Anne Marie, is I'll make sure to get in touch with it's either going to be our account manager or your customer success manager, but I'll get in touch with them and have them reach out to you about what options there are for updating that branding.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Yeah, of course. No problem. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions that we can answer before we kind of end for today? All right. Well, I don't see anything, but thank you guys so much for joining us. And thank you, Devin, for sharing all of your love of math, but also your expertise in that area and how to really help students think about math work and how it's going to incorporate or integrate into the Smart Lab.
Yeah, and if anybody, I know I go through it really fast. We had some Red Bull today, so I definitely can speak more to it if you guys reach out and give you some of those examples, or if you know anyone within your school that would love more information on it that could use the Smart Lab learning in the summer. If they're going to be there for summer school, just pass along that information so I can help out.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all, and hopefully we will see you at our next webinar.
Bye, guys.
Bye.